Mm.
His name is Tim Sauer.
Tim Sauer? Wow. Well,
Pray for him and his family.
I hate that. I hate to hear that news, but that's obvious. We're not going to live forever, and we don't want to. Any others? Gabriel has poison ivy.
Well, he got into it, so he was being scrubbed down before I left the house.
Oh, he got into it? But did he think it was pretty or something?
And he was chasing a baseball off the driveway and went down into the ditch to get it where all the poison ivy was.
Oh, boy.
And wearing shorts and a short sleeve shirt.
Uh-huh. I predict, I'm not a prophet, but I predict that he probably will not choose to go that way next time.
I'm warning him. Just telling him that.
Oh, me. Well, bless his heart. I hope he's all right. All right. When you go to services in the Lord's church, and when you go out and talk to people about their own religious beliefs and so on, what's one of the first things you hear them complain about or say that we do that doesn't make any sense to them? No music. Yeah, we don't believe in music. We don't use instruments in music. Yeah, those kinds of things. Okay, so what I wanted to do tonight, because we were talking about Bible authority for the last few weeks, and so what we're going to do is talk about Bible authority a little bit tonight too, but we're going to try to do it in this way. What I want you to do is defend instrumental music in worship, if you can. At least think of some things that you have heard as arguments they might use to defend it, and that kind of stuff. And we'll look at each of those for just a moment or two. Then we'll turn it around and we'll look at the arguments against from the standpoint of Bible authority and historical verification. That's also pretty important. So talk to me. What arguments have you heard, or what people say about defending it? Make it sound better, okay. And there's some question as to whether they hear the instruments more than they hear the people who are singing, which is it's almost always the case, yeah, as long as they play on tune, right? Yeah.
Well, I've heard the argument that when you are worshiping God, I guess with that sort of, emotional feel, I've heard it said that it's like throwing it back into the face of the devil. You know, that you're going to praise God no matter what, using instrumental music, it's going to be loud, it's going to be boisterous and emotional, and you're just giving it right back to the devil when you do.
That's interesting. All the things I wrote down here, that wasn't one of them. I haven't heard that before, but that's interesting. And throwing it in the face, I would probably ask them if you can't throw it in the face of the devil in the normal ways, prayer and evangelism and those kinds of things, preaching and teaching Christ and truth. Why wouldn't that be throwing it in the face of the devil?
I think all feelings more than
Oh, of course, feelings more than fact. Yeah. Yes.
David used music, he was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah, David used it. Okay. All right. Let's put the argument together. All things that David used in worship are things we may use in New Testament worship today. Who's going to defend that?
As well.
Do what?
David danced as well.
David danced as well.
And removed his clothes first.
Yeah. So we can do that too, I guess. Yeah.
That's
So
probably what we should be doing.
apparently so. It's, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn my head. I'm not saying anything.
The Bible doesn't say
Pray.
worship, but not to Jehovah.
Yeah.
They were worshiping pagan idols and using flutes.
Yeah.
They were worshiping pagan idols and using flutes.
Clark was a Methodist theologian, and he was echoing John Wesley, who said, "I will suit," but they were opposed to it. So Adam Clark says also in that same context that it's wrong to use instruments of music. 29 in just a moment. What other things have people said? Like plucking a stringed instrument, a guitar, fiddle, a banjo, harp, lyre, those kinds of things. Solo does mean to pluck a string or to pluck something. So we'll look at that just a little bit as well, but that does, so they say Salo would demand, since it says to pluck strings on instruments usually, that would demand us using instrumental accompaniment in our singing. Christian church uses that one, for example. Independent Christian deal. You guys make such a big deal out of such a small thing. There's no big deal to that at all. Yes, there is. If God didn't authorize it, it's a real big deal. But some people think that's real small potatoes. They say that. Others say, I like it. I enjoy it. I like it. And that's how I want to do it. Again, feelings over facts. Anybody else? Somebody else had their hand up over here. Was that Daniel? Was that you? Okay. Any other things you can think of that they say communicate what he wants and did communicate clearly what he wanted in Old Testament worship? Here's a passage that will help you understand that. 2 Chronicles 29, verse 25 start. This is where under one of the kings, Hezekiah, they were restoring temple worship here. And so during this time restoring temple worship, there was something to be done with instruments along with everything else. Verse 25 says, he then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with harps and with lyres, according to the order to offer the burnt offerings on the altar. When the burnt offerings began, song to the Lord also. Okay. Now at the completion of the burnt offerings, the king and all who were present with him bowed down and worshipped. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the officials ordered the Levites. I wrote it down and I plumb forgotten where I wrote it. Well, there's a passage in 1 Chronicles that also says the same thing, that the instruments were used as instruments of praise. Pardon me? 25:1? Let's see. You may be right. I don't think so. Jeduthun, who were to prophesy with lyres, harps, and cymbals, and the number of those who performed their service was, and they give the names of the people and how many there were. There's several times that it says the same thing. So it's very clear that they were using instruments of music, mechanical instruments of music in the Old Testament and in Old Testament worship. There's little doubt that that was authorized clearly by God. And the question is, did God have the ability to communicate to us in the New Testament? Can he make himself plain when he wants to? And the answer to that is, you know as well as I do, yes, he can make himself very plain. But if you turn to two passages we want to look at and just kind of parse them for just a moment. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19. And I think I used to say these were universal, a gathering together for one another worship, which would be in our worship assemblies, obviously. But in Ephesians 5 verse 19 it says, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, there's an ing word, that's a participle, and making melody, participle again, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Now, salo means to pluck strings. But in this context, if you look at what he says in Ephesians 5, verse 19, you're plucking the strings of the heart, making melody in the heart. You can make melody on a tambourine. You can make melody on a drum set, limited amounts. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Look at Colossians chapter 3. And there, verse 16, spiritual songs. So there's a one another aspect in both passages. There are 9 passages in the New Testament that mention singing. And none of them mention instruments except in the book of Revelation. Oh my goodness, so we forgot about that. They had instruments in heaven. They were used in that language that's used in the book of Revelation, that very, very symbolic and figurative language, and it doesn't fit it. The prayers are like incense rising up before the Lord. Your indication is helpful because we say that instruments were not used in the first century church. Instruments were not used for a long period of time in the church of the Lord, and that is admitted by musicologists. Musicologists are people who are music theory authors, or they write about musical issues historically. What's the history of music? Look at the history of music, then they're going to tell you about history of New Testament music in the church. Here's what they say, leaving the subject of Jewish backgrounds and coming voice as well. How are you going to escape persecution, escape discovery if you play a piano or you sing with a voice? Either way, you're going to be subject to persecution and subject to being discovered. So that wasn't a good argument. The argument was simply this, and the musicologist says it's George Stewart, Music and Church Worship. Not you, just a line or two from each one of them. The early Christians refuted it in the early Christian church by Hugo Leichtentritt. All ancient Christian music was vocal. We need one instrument, the peaceful word of adoration, not harps or drums or pipes or trumpets, said St. Clement of Alexandria around 200 AD. That was by Kurt Sachs, Our Musical Heritage, written in 1955. On and on we go. They say the same thing. The interesting thing is that the old Catholic Encyclopedia, not the New Catholic Encyclopedia, it says the same thing too, but the old Catholic, the American Encyclopedia says Pope Vitalian is related to have introduced organs into the churches of Western Europe. Again, Catholic Encyclopedia 1913 edition says, according to plating, Pope Vitalian introduced the organ into the church service. At all events, a strong objection to the organ in church service remained pretty general down to the 12th century, 1300s. So, though it was introduced in 666, it was on the division that took place in 1051. The Eastern Orthodox churches have not and did not and do not to this day use instruments in their worship services, and they number in the millions of people. So we're not the only ones who believe in this. But historical verification says that the early church was opposed to this kind of stuff being done. Now, there was a doctoral dissertation written by James McKinnon, and he was in writing about the patristics, or the church fathers in the patristic period of time. And he had an agenda. His doctoral dissertation was supposed to refute anybody who said the instruments were not used in the early church. He wanted to prove that they were. He wanted to prove that instruments were regularly used in the New Testament worship in the early church. And what he found from several hundred passages that he studied to try to prove this was the fathers of the early church were virtually unanimous in their hostility toward musical instruments. He went with this in his doctoral dissertation, which is used very, very effectively to show that he was unable to prove and find the use of instruments in the New Testament church. So what we've said for years, that God authorizes, he authorized singing but not instruments of music. History verifies for us by historical documentation. Those who study music history are unanimous in their understanding that these instruments were opposed. They just didn't use them. So I've just brought this up for you so that you can use some of this information if you'd like. There's some good books on the subject. One little book that's written by Reuel Shelley. Reuel had some theological problems for a time. He's a good friend of mine, but we hadn't had any words to say till recently. He wrote an excellent book on the LGBTQ plus problem, and it's probably the best thing I've seen anywhere on that subject. I reviewed it for our journal at the Warren Center. But years ago, he kind of took a sharp left turn, and some of us turned away from him and didn't have anything to do with him for years and years and years. He has a little book, though, it's called Sing His Praise. And it's very short, but it's very much to the point, and I took a lot of the information I gave you just now from these historical professors and authors to share with you some of those things. You can read that little book, and it's very helpful to you. So there's no real defense for mechanical instruments in music and worship. People are trying it. They still do. They do it because they like it. They do it because they want it. They do it because they think, ain't no big thing. She's having fun. she's going to get a hold of that instrument and play it if she. All right. So, how many of you actually had discussions with any of your friends that you're trying to convince to become Christians, and this issue's come up and you've had to defend? You have? Sure. Okay. Anybody else? Do they bring it up all the time? Do they?
Baptism is essential for salvation besides the use of instrumental music and worship. He doesn't agree with me exactly yet on that, but as far as convincing baptism is, essential immersion. With him, he said to me, I want to do everything Jesus did. I want to try to emulate Jesus. So from that one foundation, we started looking at a lot of things that Jesus did, and he saw some things just on his basis that he was lacking in.
Okay. There's one of the arguments that the people that are LGBTQ defenders make, and that is that Jesus never said anything about this issue. And somebody says, oh man, what are we going to do now? He didn't say anything about that issue. Who wrote the Bible? Please help me with that one. Who wrote the Bible? God did. The Holy Spirit was the vehicle for communication through those words. But who also participated in writing the Bible? Somebody named Jesus had something to do with it. Every single word in it. So if somebody says Jesus didn't say anything about this, hand them the Bible and say, find it for me. Because he said every word in this book. And he did. You lose your argument real quickly on that one. What else did they say? Anything else? Got them pretty close?
We have a lot of really good discussions where, but I think that the approach that I take with them is very gentle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to beat him over the head with anything, but I'm consistent with every time he asks me, I give him the same answer. So I'm extremely consistent. So some of it's not so much on what he will agree to or not, is how he receives me on a regular basis. He's not afraid to call me, ask me questions. Maybe we'll go get something to eat and he'll bring it up.
Okay.
So keep that open line of communication with him instead of condemning him. He knows it.
Yeah. The key to that is you love the sinner. That's the thing that fires the imagination and says, we got to get back to restoring the church the way it was in the first century. Except we're in the 21st century. We've got to kind of understand what they want and go back to that and restore it. And that's kind of lost right now. People aren't thinking about it very much. So we're going to talk about who is and who isn't the restorationists. Ezra and Nehemiah were. King Josiah was. Jesus and Paul were. Anytime somebody departs from a standard that God has approved, and people need to be drawn back to that standard, that's restoration. That's what it's all about. It's the plan of salvation, the organization of the church, the worship of the church. Those are things that people have departed from. We're trying to call them back to that in a restoration plea. We're going to look at all those kinds of things in a couple Wednesday nights in June and July. Anything anybody else has to say? Arguments? Complaints? Criticisms? Jim's got something.
These groups that have musical instruments, and band on stage, and people singing on stage, they're the ones that
And so on. And these are people that do this without the use of instruments, praise teams. You can't distinguish them from rock and roll bands. And it's loud, extremely loud. And they say, well, let's get into our worship now. They'll be waving their hands and listening to the loud music that'll rattle your brains. It seems to me it's kind of it really frosts me, but that's the way it works.
It seems faked to me.
Pardon me?
Faked. It feels and seems faked.
Sure, it does. But why don't they? Yeah.
It's just not real.
Some people would use it. Well, God wants me to use my talent. Well, what if your talent's trapeze act? You can just get up there and swing on the trapeze, or walk the tightrope, that kind of stuff. What if you got some other talents that you want to share with people that aren't necessarily so good? I gotta use my talent issue just falls flat on its face. It's not a defense of anything. Well, all right, I think I wanted to give you some ideas maybe to develop on your own to talk to your friends and neighbors about this issue. Because if you're talking to anybody and you're a member of the Lord's church, it is going to come up. Along with Alexander Campbell was the one that started your church. And you don't like music. Those are the things that are going to come up. People are going to talk to you about that, so you've got to deal with them. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation to ask for the prayers of this group, there's always time to ask for prayers from your brothers and sisters. We expect to be able to pray for you if you have a need. And if you have a need, the only way we're going to know about it, unless you tell us, is for you to tell us. That's the only way we'll find out. I told you about L.T. Gerganus. I don't know his first name. I had a hard time getting through the person, the operator, the switchboard person, because she called him by a name I've never heard before. L stands for something, but I've known him by LT for years and years and years. He need to come just as you are. Please do so now while we stand, while we sing. Just as I am without